Ekali Exit 24. I was driving home on a stretch of road I'd taken 1,000 times, the kind that felt like it went nowhere and promised nothing, when I noticed hazard lights blinking at the edge of the abandoned Exit 24 motel. A teenage boy stood beside the car, alone, pale under the weak glow, insisting that his mother had stepped inside to ask the clerk something. But the windows were boarded, doors chained tight, and the peeling paint told me the place had been closed for years. Something about the boy didn't make sense. His posture was stiff, almost too deliberate, like he had rehearsed standing there for hours. I parked a few feet away, noticing the passenger door of his car ajar, just slightly, as if someone, or something, had slipped out moments before I arrived. The night air was colder than it should have been, carrying the faint scent of dust and mildew, and for a second I thought I saw movement behind the glass, just a shadow sliding along the floorboards. I hesitated, hand on the door handle, realizing that whatever had left that car wasn't ready to be found, and neither was whatever had been hiding in the dark lot all this time. I stepped through the cracked side door of the motel, and the instant I crossed the threshold, the air shifted. Dust clung to every surface, coating the floorboards in a thin gray film, but the front bell on the counter gleamed as if it had been polished yesterday. I knelt slightly, brushing a fingertip over the metal, and it was warm, almost pulsing under my skin, though I hadn't touched it in hours. The lobby smelled of old wood, stale coffee, and a faint tang of something metallic that made the back of my throat tighten. I paused, listening. The silence was heavy, like the building itself was holding its breath. And then the bell rang, a soft, deliberate chime that echoed against the cracked walls. I hadn't pressed it. I hadn't even moved my hand near it. The sound lingered long enough to set every nerve on edge, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. Something shifted behind the counter. A shadow so quick and subtle it could have been my imagination, ducking away before I could get a proper look. My pulse jumped, but I forced myself to stay calm, telling myself it was probably a rat, or maybe just a trick of the light, though nothing else in the room moved, nothing else breathed. I moved closer, stepping cautiously over debris, broken furniture, splintered wood, an old chair lying on its side, and tried to peer over the counter. The shadow wasn't there. The bell sat innocently as if nothing had happened, though the warmth still lingered in my fingertips. I leaned my ear toward it, half expecting another chime, half dreading it. A low, almost imperceptible scrape came from behind the counter. Something, or someone, was shifting just out of view, moving silently, intentionally. I called out, my voice breaking the stillness in a way that made it feel even heavier, but no answer came. Only the sound of air moving through the cracked windows, a faint whistle of wind along the floorboards. The lobby was larger than it looked from the outside, hallways leading off to rooms that smelled of decay, some with doors hanging on one hinge, others closed tight as if guarding something inside. Each step I took creaked in a rhythm that seemed to echo, growing slightly faster, louder, until I felt it was being counted. I circled the counter slowly, eyes scanning every dark corner, every shadow, every flicker of movement. Nothing appeared, yet the sense of being watched grew stronger with every heartbeat. The air seemed to carry weight, pressing against my chest, and the bell remained in the center of the lobby, innocent and gleaming like a lure. Then I noticed a faint reflection on the cracked floor, something sliding past the edge of the counter. I froze. My hands gripped the edge, knuckles white. Whatever had been behind there wasn't ready to be confronted, and I knew that even if it were human, it had been observing me long before I stepped into that room. I tried to shake the thought, telling myself to focus on finding the boy's mother, the only real reason I'd come inside. But the longer I lingered, the more the lobby seemed to stretch. the shadows deepening, the silence amplifying the smallest sounds, the whisper of my boots, the scrape of my own clothing. Each noise seemed to provoke a response, a fleeting shadow, a brush of movement at the edge of my vision, the bell almost vibrating as if it carried the presence of something unseen. I realized I wasn't alone, and yet I couldn't see anyone or anything with certainty. And then, before I could move any closer, a soft thud echoed from deeper inside the hallway, a sound too deliberate to be random, as if the motel itself were leading me somewhere I didn't want to go. I swallowed hard, listening to my own ragged breathing, and knew I had no choice but to follow it, drawn deeper into a place that had been empty for years, yet somehow, impossibly, still inhabited. I called out for the boy's mother, my voice bouncing off the cracked walls and long-abandoned hallways, but only distant footsteps answered back, soft at first, then louder, as if someone, or something, was moving just ahead, staying deliberately out of sight. The lights along the hall flickered with a lazy, uneven rhythm, casting long, shifting shadows that made every door look alive, breathing, waiting. Every single door remained shut and unyielding except for one. Room 9, its frame cracked, paint peeling, the door hanging half open as though inviting me in. The air along the hall was thick and stale, smelling faintly of mildew, dust, and something faintly metallic, like blood that had dried and lingered for years. Keys hung on a wooden board beside the elevator shaft, chipped and cracked with age, but one hook was empty, swinging slightly even though no wind moved through the boarded-up windows. My pulse quickened, a cold prickle sliding up my neck, as I noticed a shadow sliding across the far wall, thin, low, stretching, and impossible to trace to any object or figure I could see. Every step I took toward room 9 made the floor creak under my boots in a rhythm that seemed almost intentional, almost communicating something I couldn't quite understand. The footsteps that had echoed ahead of me grew closer in my mind, then farther, then vanished, leaving a suffocating silence that pressed down like concrete. I stopped halfway, scanning the hallway again, shining my flashlight over each door, each cracked molding, but nothing moved. At least, nothing human. The empty hallway warped around the glow of my light, turning corners darker, walls longer, shadows sharper, until I felt like I was walking into a space that had stretched and reshaped itself while I wasn't looking. And yet, I knew I was being guided. Something was steering me, guiding my attention to room 9, toward the empty hook, toward a place that had been waiting for years to be entered. The further I advanced, the more I felt a soft vibration through the floorboards, subtle at first, then more insistent, like footsteps running just below the surface, echoing in time with my own. I froze, listening to my own ragged breathing, to the whisper of movement along the walls, and realized the hallway was no longer empty. It was alive, aware, and aware of me. A cold gust rolled out from room 9 as I neared the doorway, carrying with it the faint smell of heat and damp fabric, as if someone, or something, had just passed through. I swallowed hard and stepped closer, each footfall deliberate, heart thudding, trying to ignore the instinct screaming at me to turn back. A shadow flickered along the wall again, low and thin, moving impossibly fast and vanishing before I could focus. I shined the beam directly toward it, but the hallway remained empty. Doors still shut, dust undisturbed, except for the open door of room 9 and the empty hook on the keyboard swinging slightly as if shaken by a hand that no one could see. I felt it then, the undeniable pull of the room, the sense that something was waiting behind the half-open door, and that once I stepped inside, there would be no turning back. And even as I raised my flashlight and took that step, the hallway seemed to exhale, a soft, cold breath brushing the back of my neck, as though the motel itself was warning me, or welcoming me, into a presence that had been patient for years, Room 9 stood half open, the gap in the door pulling me forward like a silent invitation I didn't want but couldn't resist. The air inside was warmer than the hallway, heavy with the scent of damp fabric, dust, and faint soap that hadn't been used in years. The bed was perfectly made, sheets tucked tight, pillows fluffed, and atop it lay a set of motel keys, shiny and new, resting neatly on the pillow as if someone had just placed them there moments before I arrived. The bathroom ran hot water on its own, steam curling around the mirror and fogging it so thickly I could barely see my own reflection. I reached out, wiping a patch with the back of my hand, expecting only to see myself. But the glass seemed to ripple under my touch, the steam shifting in strange currents as though something had moved behind it. A faint outline appeared behind the shower curtain, too soft to define, like a person blurred through glass, lingering for a heartbeat before disappearing entirely when I pulled it aside. Nothing was there. The curtain hung empty, the tiles untouched, yet the air carried the residue of movement, moist, heavy, and deliberate. My breath fogged the mirror again as I stared, listening to the faint drip of water from the faucet and the creak of the floorboards under my boots, every sound amplified by the stillness of the room. The keys on the bed seemed to shimmer slightly in the dim light, catching my attention over and over, each glance making them feel closer than they should be, as if they were waiting for me to pick them up, or maybe waiting for something else to return. The temperature shifted, cooler at first around my shoulders, then hot against my face, like someone had leaned close, invisible but present, exhaling breath that carried the sharp tang of metal. My pulse spiked. Instinct screamed to leave, but my body was rooted, drawn deeper into the room by the impossible warmth, the unnatural order of a bed made in a motel abandoned for years, and the faint echo of movement that the human eye couldn't fully catch. A shadow passed just behind me, brushing the edge of my peripheral vision, and I spun, flashlight sweeping the corners, the closet, the cracked ceiling panels, but everything remained still. Nothing alive, nothing solid, and yet I couldn't shake the certainty that I was being observed, studied, and tested by whatever had been left behind in the steam, the keys, the shifting shadows. I stepped back, heart hammering, and the air seemed to recoil slightly, carrying with it the smell of damp earth and faint, acrid heat. The keys rattled softly on the pillow, though no one had touched them. I could feel the pressure in the room, subtle, like someone standing just behind my shoulder, leaning over, waiting for me to do something, anything, that would commit me further to whatever presence had been lingering in this half-forgotten space. And as I hesitated at the doorway, a soft shift of air brushed past my ear, and I realized the outline behind the shower curtain hadn't moved. It had been waiting, patient, tethered to the room, to the steam, to the keys. Whatever was here, it hadn't finished with me yet. I wiped the mirror with the palm of my hand, expecting nothing more than my own reflection, staring back from the fogged glass. But the steam clung stubbornly, smearing into streaks that distorted my face like ripples in a pond. The bathroom was empty. I had checked twice, yet the air behind me felt crowded, thick, as if someone stood far too close. The mirror cleared in uneven patches, revealing the faint outline of my shoulders, the dim light behind me. And then, in a slow creeping emergence, the shape of another figure forming just inches away. A woman stood directly behind me, her head tilted slightly downward, long black hair hanging in wet, heavy strands that hid most of her face. Water dripped from her hair in slow, thick rivulets, spotting the floor at my feet even though nothing was physically behind me in the room. Her presence in the reflection felt wrong. Not sudden, but gradual, like she had been there all along, waiting for me to notice. My breath caught in my throat, a tight, painful knot, and for a moment I couldn't move, I couldn't even blink. The mirror felt colder the longer I stared, as though someone else's breath had fogged it before mine ever touched the glass. I turned sharply, faster than instinct should have allowed, expecting cold hands reaching for me, a face too close, something lunging or whispering. But the bathroom behind me was silent, empty, and still wrapped in drifting steam. The only sound was the slow gurgle of water disappearing down the drain. Yet the room felt used, recently, aggressively, like someone had been standing where I now stood seconds before I entered. I looked back at the mirror, half hoping the reflection had reset to something normal, but the woman was gone, leaving only the outline of my own face, pale and strained. I stepped toward the doorway, wanting distance, wanting cold hallway air, but the keys on the pillow rattled again, sharper this time, as if something had brushed past them or nudged the mattress beneath. The room felt less empty with every passing second. The walls seemed to swell inward, trapping warmth, trapping breath, and the air carried the faint scent of wet soil and crushed leaves, like someone had come in from the rain and stood dripping in the middle of the room. I caught movement at the edge of my vision, a small shift, low to the floor, and turned in time to see a wet footprint forming near the threshold, the water pooling into the shape of toes and an arch before soaking silently into the cracked carpet. It pointed toward the parking lot, not the hallway behind me, as if someone had stepped inside from outside, paused, and then changed direction. The footprint glistened under the dim ceiling light, not fading, not drying, just holding its shape in a way no ordinary water should. A chill crawled up the back of my neck, and the hair on my arms rose despite the heavy warmth of the room. I backed away, eyes locked on the doorway, the keys, the footprint, trying to make sense of a presence that didn't follow any logic I knew. Something had been inside this room with me, reflected clearly, undeniably, yet it moved without sound, without weight, without leaving a trail, except for the one it wanted me to see. The steam thinned behind me, drifting like breath dispersing in cold air, and I realized the mirror no longer showed my reflection at all. It showed the doorway, and the silhouette of a woman just outside it. I ran back outside, boots crunching over cracked concrete, the night wind cutting across the empty lot like a living thing, sharp and deliberate. The car was where I'd left it, but something had changed. The boy's passenger door hung wide open now, the interior dome light flickering weakly, throwing pale rectangles across the gravel. My heart hammered as I stepped closer, scanning the lot, but there were no footprints leading away, nothing to show where anyone might have gone. Only my own tracks, pressed into the dirt where I had run from the building, leading up to the vehicle and stopping abruptly. The silence pressed in, thick and intentional, as though the motel itself had closed the world around me, isolating me from sound, from safety, from reason. Every instinct screamed at me to retreat, but my gaze was locked on that swinging door, the empty interior, the faint scent of warm soap and dust that hadn't been there minutes before. The dome light flickered again, throwing shadows that didn't match the contours of the car, stretching sideways along the cracked asphalt, long, thin shapes that moved against the light without moving the car itself. I stepped closer, hand resting lightly on the roof, heart hammering in my ears, and felt a faint draft, too localized to be wind, moving along the line of the open door, brushing my face, whispering cold against my neck. I crouched slightly, trying to see inside to find the boy or any sign of his mother, but the interior was empty, pristine, almost staged. Nothing disturbed, nothing out of place. Yet I knew someone, or something, had just been there, had left, had waited. My fingers grazed the seat, and a faint vibration ran up my arm, like the car itself was aware of me, like it was warning me or inviting me in. I took a step back, scanning the lot again. The wind had dropped, the night now utterly still. carrying only the distant hum of the highway, which seemed impossibly far. Every shadow seemed to thrum with weight, edges curling inward, hiding movement my eyes could never catch. And then I noticed it. The dome light blinked one final time and went out, leaving the interior as dark as the asphalt beneath it, yet the door remained wide open. It waited, patient, expectant. I swallowed, heart pounding, the hairs on the back of my neck rigid, and felt the truth settle over me like ice. Whatever had been in the motel, whatever had moved in room 9, was now here, in the car, or had been, and had left its mark in a way I couldn't explain. I stepped back and drew a shallow breath. The lot remained empty, silent except for the faint whisper of air shifting across the cracked concrete, and yet the presence of something unseen lingered so strongly that I could feel its weight pressing against me, wrapping around the car, around the empty doorway, around my own chest. I realized the boy was gone, vanished, leaving behind nothing but the open door, and a silence so absolute it seemed to thrum with memory, as though the abandoned lot itself remembered every visitor who had ever stepped inside, and demanded they leave something behind. And somewhere behind me, in the empty lobby of the motel, the bell chimed once more, soft and deliberate, announcing that the game was far from over. I crouched beside the car, scanning the cracked concrete when I noticed them. Small, barefoot prints appearing where none had been before. They were tiny, delicate, the imprint of a child, leading across the lot in a straight line toward the open field beyond the pavement. I stepped closer, heart hammering, and realized the prints didn't continue. They simply stopped halfway, vanishing as if the boy had ceased to exist mid-step. The air thickened around me, heavy with the scent of damp dirt and faint ozone, a smell that made my stomach tighten. I glanced down at the dashboard, and there it was, a single motel key, gleaming in the weak glow of my flashlight, sitting on the surface where I had never placed it. My fingers hovered over it, reluctant to touch, as the metal seemed to hum softly under my skin, a vibration that was almost imperceptible, but unmistakably alive. I stepped back toward the lobby, every instinct screaming that something wasn't finished, that I'd been drawn into a space that didn't follow the rules of time or logic. The wind shifted in the lot, carrying the faint scent of steam and wet hair, and then I heard it. A soft chime from the front bell, deliberate and slow, echoing across the empty motel. I hadn't pressed it. I hadn't touched it. Someone, or something, had. My pulse jumped. The sound seemed to stretch, lingering in the silence long enough for my mind to trace it back to the empty lobby, the hallway I had just fled, and even to room 9 itself. Shadows shifted along the edges of my flashlight, stretching unnaturally, moving against the light as though aware of my gaze. The air felt thick with anticipation, as if the lot itself were waiting, holding its breath, recording every move I made, and marking my presence for something that would never let me go. I crouched again beside the open passenger door, glancing down at the small footprints that ended abruptly in nothing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was impossible, the kind of thing that logic couldn't explain. My own boots pressed into the dirt, grounding me in reality, yet the lot around me pulsed with an energy I could feel in my bones, tugging at my thoughts, pulling me toward the field, toward the empty air where the prints vanished. I dared a closer look at the dashboard key. It seemed to shimmer slightly, the metal reflecting a light that didn't exist, or perhaps reflecting something I wasn't meant to see. I swallowed hard and backed away, glancing once more at the doorway to the motel, the lobby, the open hallway, the room 9 door, and realized the motel had not let go of its secrets, and I had become entangled in them. A soft exhale of air brushed across my neck, and I spun around, flashlight sweeping the lot. Nothing moved, nothing breathed. Yet the keys, the footprints, the bell. Every object bore witness to what had happened, as if the motel itself had recorded the presence of the boy and refused to release it. And then, in the stillness of the night, the bell chimed once more, lingering longer than any human hand could make it. A soft, deliberate note that seemed to signal an arrival or a warning. I took a step back, heart hammering, the keys still on the dashboard, the footprints half-formed, and knew I was standing in a place where reality no longer applied, and that whatever had begun here would follow me far beyond exit 24. Route 19 was usually quiet at that hour, the kind of lonely stretch where the trees pressed close enough to swallow most of the road's light, but that night felt even emptier than usual. I drove slow, letting the beams carve through the drifting mist, trying to shake off the numb calm that settles in after too many uneventful hours. I didn't see her at first, just a shape that didn't make sense in the pattern of the lines, something standing too still to be an animal and too centered to be a person out for help. When the headlights finally caught her, she didn't flinch. She just stood there in the middle of the lane, hair hanging in a wet tangle that hid everything but the pale outline of her cheek. Her clothes clung to her like she'd crawled up from a river, though the pavement around her was bone dry. As I stepped out, the cold felt suddenly sharper, carrying a faint metallic scent that wasn't there moments before. She turned slightly toward me, just enough that her mouth was visible through the curtain of hair, and whispered 4 words that drifted through the fog like they'd been waiting for someone to hear them. "I need to get back." I guided her toward the cruiser, keeping her close enough that I could hear the soft drip of water hitting the asphalt. But as we walked, the woods behind her seemed to swallow the sound of my idling engine until it faded into a low, unnatural hush, like the forest was listening, holding its breath for whatever came next. I eased her into the rear of the cruiser, the door closing with a muted click that felt louder than it had any right to be, the sound echoing into the cold night like a warning. She didn't sit fully, just lowered herself enough to keep her weight balanced, hair still damp and clinging to her face, and I could feel the heat draining from the car around her, as if her presence pulled it out in thin, steady fingers. I radioed dispatch with her description, my voice precise, controlled, because that's what you do in these situations. But my eyes kept flicking back to the rear window, to the dark shape that had followed us down the road, even though there was nothing there, or, at least, nothing that should have been. I waited for confirmation, leaning on the center console, and that's when I heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping rising from the glass behind her. Not a knock against metal or ice, but a slow, deliberate beat, like fingernails drumming against the pane from inside. My pulse caught, and I froze mid-breath, straining to place the sound, trying to convince myself it was the wind, the uneven road, some trick of the cold that made everything hum in unfamiliar frequencies. The tapping came again, steadier this time, each beat punctuating the silence in the cruiser, echoing off the roof and panels. I swiveled slightly in the driver's seat, catching it reflected faintly in the rearview mirror, and my stomach sank. The seat was empty. Nothing stirred. The door hadn't been opened. The gravel outside showed no tracks. Not a single footprint. She sat there, still and quiet, like a doll abandoned on the seat, yet the tapping continued. Steady, measured, impossible. I stepped out to check, the snow cold beneath my boots, crunching in small, uneven bursts as if the earth itself was breathing underfoot. The light from the cruiser's dome cut a narrow beam across the road, illuminating nothing but her back, the dark stretch of asphalt, and the shadowed tree line that framed the road like some silent audience. And then I realized she wasn't behind me. Not in the car, not on the shoulder, not in the narrow pool of light spilling from the headlights. When I turned, the empty road stretched ahead, and there she was, standing in the center of the lane, exactly where she had been when I first spotted her, hair falling in damp curtains over her face. Motionless. Waiting. My pulse pounded against my ribs in sudden, frantic rhythm. The blood in my ears loud enough that I almost didn't hear the low hum of the idling engine or the rustle of wind through the pines. I blinked, and she hadn't moved. I blinked again, and still. Same posture, same frozen figure. The very air around her seeming to hold a pause, like the world had caught its breath. I opened the cruiser door slowly, careful not to startle her or myself, and the cold air rushed in with the scent of wet earth, pine, and something faintly metallic that reminded me of iron. I reached toward her, hand outstretched, but the space between us felt wrong. Stretched, unnatural, like I was trying to touch someone through a pane of ice that didn't exist. Her damp clothes clung to her frame, the water shimmering faintly in the low light, and yet, when my fingers brushed toward her arm, it was like reaching into thin smoke. She flickered, just slightly, enough to make the corner of my eye catch a subtle displacement, a vibration in the air that wasn't there before. I stepped back, heart hammering, and every instinct in me screamed that she shouldn't be able to be in two places at once. Yet, there she was, and there she had been, both impossibly present and already gone. The road behind the cruiser seemed to stretch darker than it should, the tree line pressing closer, swallowing sound and light, holding its own secrets in the frozen night. The tapping from the rear window was gone now, replaced by a hollow silence that rang in my ears, sharper than any scream. I closed the door, every muscle tense, aware that the seat behind me, the very space where she had just been, felt empty, and yet weighted, heavy, as if something had leaned back into it and refused to leave. I slid into the driver's seat, shivering, and tried to settle her in for the second time, but her eyes never met mine. They were fixed on the road, on the darkness beyond the headlights, on something only she could see, and a slow dread settled over me, a certainty that whatever we thought we understood about her presence, about the night, had already begun to unravel. The cruiser idled there, silent except for the faint hum of the engine, the weight of her in the back seat, and the impossible knowledge that the moment I looked away, she could be anywhere. And she was. I circled the woman again, keeping my steps measured, careful not to startle her, or whatever force hung over that stretch of road, but the further I moved, the more wrong the world felt. The tree line pressed in tight on both sides, black trunks cutting against the faint reflection of my headlights, shadows pooling into shapes that I couldn't name. She didn't turn away, didn't flinch, just stood there, soaked through, clothes clinging to her frame as if she had waded through water moments before. Yet the pavement beneath her was dry, frostless, undisturbed, and that contradiction burrowed into my chest with cold certainty. Each step I took toward her made the hair on my arms rise, the cold biting deeper, sharp and personal, as though it had followed me in through the door of the world itself. I reached for her wrist, thinking to guide her, to make sure she stayed out of harm's way, but my fingers brushed only air, or something insubstantial, slipping through my grip like smoke. For a heartbeat she flickered, her body caught between two states, a misalignment of light and mass that made her look unreal, like a figure trapped between frames of some broken recording. Her lips moved again, repeating the same phrase she had whispered before. I need to go back. But the emphasis was different now, fractured, stretched across the cold night air in a rhythm that didn't quite match human speech. Every syllable curved and bent in impossible ways, echoing faintly, as if the night itself were reshaping her voice. I took another step forward, trying to meet her gaze, to ground her presence in something I could understand, but she remained fixed, just beyond the reach of my comprehension. The world around her seemed to hold still. The wind, the distant rustle of pines, even the patter of snow on the shoulder was swallowed by a sudden, unnatural hush. I could feel the weight of her stare through the air pressing against me, guiding me to recognize a rule I didn't yet know. The road wasn't empty, not really, and she wasn't alone, even if there was no one to see. The further I went, the more her outline shimmered, like heat rising off asphalt on a hot summer day, but reversed, cold instead of warm, pulling my senses into disagreement. I felt my mind start to tighten, tightening like a noose of awareness, noticing every impossibility, her wet hair not dripping, yet darkened with moisture, her frame slightly off balance, but gravity still obeying it. Her eyes hidden yet somehow following my every movement. I tried to rationalize, telling myself it was exhaustion, the monotony of the night shift catching up, the optical distortions of headlights on damp asphalt, but the logic refused to hold, slipping through my fingers like frost. And then it happened again. That subtle flicker, the brief displacement of her shape, just enough for the corner of my vision to catch a movement that shouldn't have existed. My stomach dropped. For a moment, I was certain I had imagined it, but the wet scrape of her clothing as she shifted weight confirmed it. She was there, and yet not entirely there, a presence out of sync with the world. Every instinct I had screamed to retreat, to step back, to leave the stretch of highway to its unnatural quiet. But the pull of the unknown anchored me, insisting I stay, that I witness. The night itself seemed to lean in, compressing, holding its breath, and the shadows of the trees grew darker and closer, curling around the road in anticipation. She tilted her head slightly, repeating the phrase again, slower this time, deliberate. Go back, as though warning me, as though the road itself were listening and waiting for my next move. And in that instant, I understood that this stretch of asphalt was no longer a road, and she was no longer just a person in need of help. She was something else, something tethered to the space in a way that defied reason. I could feel her presence ripple across the distance, tugging at my perception, bending the reality of what should have been ordinary. I reached forward again, but she flickered once more, her form splitting and collapsing in the corner of my vision, and I stopped, hand frozen in midair, realizing that I was no longer certain whether I was approaching her or she was approaching me, or if the road itself had moved us both without permission. The silence thickened, heavier than the air waiting, and I knew, with a certainty that made my chest tighten, that wherever she stood now, she would return again, no matter how far I thought I had taken her away from the center line. Dispatch's voice came through the radio, fragmented, urging me to hold position until backup could reach the stretch of Route 19 where I'd found her. But the words sounded hollow, swallowed by the wind that hissed through the cruiser's vents. I felt the weight of the night pressing inward, heavier than the cold, thicker than the air, as if the tree line itself had leaned closer to listen. She sat, or hovered, I couldn't tell, just beyond reach, her form shaking slightly, wet strands of hair clinging to her cheeks. But her voice came again, this time fractured, syllable by syllable, each piece bending unnaturally in the cold air. You shouldn't stop for me. It wasn't a warning in the way anyone would expect. It carried a weight I could feel through my chest, a pull in the nerves that suggested something beyond the physical world, something patient and inevitable. My fingers tightened around the steering wheel, every muscle taut, trying to reconcile the impossible cadence of her words with the quiet hum of the engine, the soft crackle of radio static filling the spaces between the syllables. Before I could respond, before the rational part of my mind could act, she shifted, melting from the shoulder of the road like water through fingers, and reappeared mid-lane, hair blown across her face by a wind I couldn't feel, motionless as if the road itself had carried her there. My pulse jumped, the metallic taste of adrenaline sharp against the back of my throat, and every instinct screamed that this wasn't a person behaving strangely. This was something else, something unbound by the rules of space and motion. The wet scrunch of her clothing, the chill radiating off her frame, made me recoil instinctively, yet I couldn't look away. Some part of me demanded that I understand what I was seeing, even as all logic shattered in the glow of the headlights. The trees lining the highway seemed to shiver with her sudden presence, dark trunks stretching taller, closer, the shadow between them deepening in response, as if the forest itself recognized the shift, bending to accommodate the impossible. The air carried faint sounds that weren't there a moment ago. A low creak of wood, the soft scrape of water, the whisper of something sliding just out of sight. And I realized that every step I'd taken, every careful approach, had done nothing to stabilize her presence. She was untethered, moving across the world in ways that defied any sense of physics, any expectation of human motion. And yet she remained anchored to this road, repeating the same warning over and over in a voice that was both hers and not hers, layered with something colder, something patient. I tried to close the distance, to step into her space and reach for some explanation, but the air itself seemed to resist me, heavy and viscous, bending around her, making my movements sluggish, disjointed. Her hair whipped in patterns that didn't match the wind, clinging, then shifting in impossible directions. And when I looked at her face through the curtain of wet strands, I caught the flicker of something else, a pause in the texture of her skin, a shimmer that suggested she wasn't fully here, wasn't fully human. My stomach turned. The cruiser, the road, the trees, even the faint glow of the dashboard lights, all felt secondary, incidental, shadows cast in the presence of whatever she had become, whatever force had chosen this stretch of asphalt as its tether. The minutes stretched, long and uneven, the cold pressing deeper into my bones, and I felt the first real surge of fear, sharp and precise, in the pit of my stomach. She whispered again, the fragmented warning curling over the air. You shouldn't. Stop. For me. And then she shifted once more, dissolving from the lane into nothing, only to reappear as if the night itself had carried her there, just out of reach, just beyond comprehension. The radio hissed and popped with static, the engine hummed like a heartbeat out of sync, and I knew, with an almost physical certainty, that she was waiting, watching, and that the road would demand we follow rules I could neither see nor understand. I tried to restrain her again, but my hands passed through nothing, brushing only the hollow weight of fabric that seemed suspended over air, the sleeves wet and clinging, yet empty beneath, like some cruel mimic of a human form. The cruiser felt suddenly enormous, the seats and console stretching away from me, the headlights casting shadows that shifted independently, unbound by any logical source. The road outside was silent, the tree line beyond motionless, yet a chill pressed against the glass as if it had mass, a presence that didn't belong to the car. A truck passed, headlights slicing across the asphalt and illuminating her outline for a fraction of a second, and I saw only the black road behind her, the dark nothing she had become. My stomach dropped as the figure wavered, bending in the cold air, a glitch in the texture of reality that I could neither ignore nor explain. Then she vanished entirely. One moment she was there, wet hair and weightless form, and the next, the space she occupied shimmered with an unnatural clarity, leaving the air colder, the highway hushed, the headlights reflecting only the empty lane ahead. My breath fogged inside the cruiser, crystallizing instantly in the unnatural cold, and I realized the cabin itself had become an extension of the road, a corridor between states, the familiar now foreign. I gripped the wheel, heart hammering, every instinct screaming that she hadn't left, had never left, but had moved into a space I couldn't see, couldn't touch, and perhaps wasn't meant to. Minutes passed, or maybe seconds, but the stillness felt like hours, broken only by the faintest flicker in the corner of my dashcam's frame. At first, I thought it was a reflection, a trick of the light, but the subtle movement repeated, a hesitant, wavering step backward into the darkness. The figure reappeared just long enough to catch the periphery, a whisper of motion, a shadow that made the cold press harder against my chest. I leaned closer to the screen, trying to reconcile the image with the reality in the car, but the more I focused, the more the lines between what was on the road and what existed in the camera blurred. Her hair shimmered faintly, droplets reflecting like tiny fragments of moonlight that weren't there in the sky. Her wet form slipped and bent in ways that no human body could manage, and the tiny backward steps on the dashcam suggested she was receding into something larger than the road, into a space I couldn't follow. I tried to call her name, to speak into the night, but the words stuck in my throat, swallowed by the cold. The engine hummed unevenly beneath me, the heater futile, the car suddenly a vessel for a quiet, creeping presence that held its own rhythm and rules. Each flicker of the dashcam intensified the tension, the glow of her form pulsing briefly, as if teasing the edges of my perception, daring me to look too closely, to make contact with the reality I wasn't equipped to survive. I felt my pulse thrumming in my ears, every nerve on alert, and yet the seconds passed slowly, stretching the night around me. Then, one final flicker longer than the others, and she vanished into pure darkness again, leaving the frame of the dashcam empty but for the trembling fog of breath inside the cruiser, the faint trace of moisture on the windows, the whisper of impossible movement lingering in the metal. The road outside was still, the trees waiting silently, and I realized with a cold certainty that she could reappear anywhere at any time. Always tethered to this exact stretch of asphalt, always beyond my reach, always warning, always watching. The dashcam hummed faintly, the only proof that she had ever existed there, in the frame, in the night, in the space between what I could touch and what I could not. Dawn was starting to scrape pale light across the horizon when backup finally reached Route 19. Guided by the fragmented radio transmissions I had managed to send before the night swallowed the frequency entirely. The cruiser sat alone on the dark asphalt, engine still humming faintly, frost clinging to the edges of the windshield like a thin veil, but she was gone. Every instinct screamed that her absence didn't mean safety, only that she was biding her time. I checked the dashcam first, the little red light blinking steadily, and immediately my stomach turned. There she was, appearing again in the same spot she had been when I first saw her hours earlier, each flicker of the frame a heartbeat of impossibility. Over and over she repeated the same movement, stepping back into the darkness along the exact center line, as if trapped by some invisible rule, yet untouchable, beyond the reach of logic. The road was quiet except for the faint whisper of wind through the pines, the frost crunching under approaching boots, but the air around the cruiser remained heavy, oppressive, carrying that same metallic cold scent that had accompanied her from the start. The dashcam flickered again, and each blink of her form seemed to imprint itself into the car, the air growing colder, heavier, as if her presence had seeped into the fabric of the vehicle itself. Records from local law enforcement flooded my mind. Previous sightings of a woman on this stretch, each one following the same pattern. Those who stopped, those who tried to help, each warned, each touched by the impossible before vanishing into the cold. The knowledge gnawed at me, sharp and precise, the logic of repetition so rigid it felt like a curse pressed into the asphalt itself. I tried to call out, to speak into the cold, but the words stuck somewhere in my chest. The forest surrounding the road seemed denser than before. the shadows of the trees pooling unnaturally, stretching across the highway, moving like dark water with the first light of day. Every movement in the cruiser felt exaggerated, the seat cold beneath my hands, the door handles icy, and a quiet tremor of fear traveled through me as I realized the full scope of what I was witnessing. She wasn't just a person. She was a pattern, a rule of the night, a presence tied to this stretch of highway in ways that defied explanation. The dashcam flickered again, longer this time, and her form reappeared for just a second in the corner of the frame. She lifted her head, and for the first time, I saw her eyes, wide, impossibly black, reflecting nothing of the road or the trees or the first weak glint of dawn. Her mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear, the audio cutting off at the moment the syllables would have reached the microphone. The feeling of her gaze pressed through the glass, through the air, and into my mind. A cold and patient awareness that made the hair on my arms stiffen. The temperature in the car plummeted again, frost beginning to form along the edges of the console, like she had never left, like she had never needed to leave. Outside, the road stretched quiet and empty, but the tree line seemed to lean closer, the forest waiting, the air thick with expectation. I realized with absolute certainty that she would return, always in that exact spot, always tethered to the center line, always appearing in the periphery of memory and vision. The dashcam hummed faintly, the last frame showing her small movement in the darkness, and I understood that this place wasn't meant to be left, not for her, and not for anyone who dared to follow the rules she enforced. The last transmission. The first time I listened to the recording, it was quiet, almost disappointingly so, until the faint howl of wind slipped through the speakers, sharp and persistent, as if the storm itself had been trapped in the wires. I had been reopening archived transmissions during a routine audit, something meant to occupy my eyes and ears while the day moved past. But the air in the office seemed colder as I leaned in, the fluorescent lights above doing little to shake off the chill. The logs crackled faintly beneath the voice, timestamps marching past in uneven rhythm, warning bells blinking for storms that no one could see anymore. The patrolman's voice emerged slowly at first, clipped, professional, detailing a vehicle stranded along Ridge Pass, its engine dead, doors open, headlights cut into the snow like eyes. Every hour, he reported, seemed to grow heavier, as though the storm itself were intensifying, piling layers of ice and fear over the mountain, and I felt a weight settle in my chest that had nothing to do with the weather outside the office window. I could hear the crunch of the microphone against his collar, the subtle hiss of static, and beneath it all, the low wind that seemed to move independently, almost sentient, as though the pass was alive and listening. He mentioned the warnings again, how the storm had been predicted, but these logs carried the sense of inevitability, a creeping dread that had nothing to do with weather reports. My fingers hovered over the console, scrolling through notes I had taken years ago, remembering his first call. The one about a car abandoned on the side of the road, tires half buried, doors swinging open in the gusts. But hearing it now, it was different. The storm wasn't just background noise anymore. It had become the main character, pressing against the cruiser, against the trees, against every word the officer spoke, filling the silence with a living, breathing presence. I could hear the faint crackle of radio interference, the sharp pulse of snow hitting metal, the subtle sway of the microphone catching the rhythm of the wind outside the mountains. As I sat there, trying to reconcile the memory with what I was hearing, the patrolman's words began to take on a weight beyond protocol. He described the vehicle, the road, the snow piling against the tires, but he also spoke of the emptiness around it. The absolute stillness, despite the storm's fury, the kind that makes you certain someone, or something, is waiting just beyond the next ridge. There was a point where the wind hissed so sharply through the recording that it sounded like it had entered the office itself, cold against the nape of my neck, and I realized that listening to the file wasn't passive. It demanded something of me, made me remember the isolation of that mountain pass, the endless whiteout that trapped anyone daring to travel through it, and the sense that once you were there, the storm was no longer simply weather. It was aware. My pen hovered over my notes, shaking slightly, as the faint howl rose again, not just a sound but a warning, repeating beneath the officer's calm, measured voice. The file began, as it always did, with that relentless wind, as though the storm had never ended, carrying with it the faintest echo of someone calling out into the void. I leaned back, trying to convince myself it was just a storm, just an old recording, and yet the hair on my arms stood rigid, my pulse quickened, and the room felt impossibly still, as though Ridge Pass itself had followed me here and had no intention of letting me leave until I'd listened closely enough to understand that the night it recorded was far from over. The snow had thickened as the patrolmen moved along Ridge Pass, each flake driven sideways by a wind that seemed to know exactly where to bite. And already I could hear it through the recording, faint and constant, scraping against the microphone like nails across glass. He reported a sedan, stopped sideways across the road, its doors wide open as though someone had abandoned it mid-motion, and yet the snow left no evidence of entry or exit. No footprints, no disturbance, nothing to suggest that it had been touched by human hands. The headlights flickered weakly, barely cutting through the whiteout that surrounded the cruiser, throwing only a shallow circle of light into the storm, as though the world beyond had been erased. Each time he spoke, the wind caught in his words, sharp and fragmented. The static carrying a subtle tremor, and I could feel the emptiness of the pass pressing against the edges of the recording, drawing me into that frozen isolation. He approached the vehicle cautiously, breath misting inside the cab, snow clinging to his coat, and described the seatbelt hanging across the driver's side like a pendulum, moving slightly even though the air was still inside the car, as though it had a life of its own. My fingers tightened on the desk as I listened, the mundane object suddenly charged, an ordinary thing turning sinister in the white silence. Then came the first sound that didn't belong to him or the storm, a faint, childlike cry, muffled and trembling, carried from somewhere deep in the woods that flanked the highway. The sound was distant, almost teasing, dissolving into the howl of the snow, but it drew him, irresistibly, toward the tree line, and I could hear his boots crunching over a surface that left no mark, leaving me unsettled in the office, imagining him stepping onto a path the snow had refused to record. The officer described it carefully, speaking into the radio as though saying the words aloud could anchor him to reality, but the cries kept drifting, cutting through the static, forcing him to move closer, to peer into darkness where the storm had erased all detail. The vehicle sat beside him like a monument of unease, lights dim, doors open, and snow piling against the tires. But the moment he shifted his attention toward the forest, the windshield blurred under drifting ice crystals, the headlights barely penetrating the swirling white, leaving only shadows that seemed too deliberate, too precise, to belong to the snow alone. He paused, calling out into the emptiness, and each time he did, the crying stopped. Each step back, it returned, circling him, taunting him with a presence that should not exist. The wind, which had carried the faint sound at first, seemed to still for a heartbeat when the cry halted. A silence so complete it pressed against the microphone like a hand, and then it picked up again, low and sorrowful, this time closer, as if the child, or something imitating a child, was weaving around him, keeping pace in the untrackable snow. The officer's own breathing grew heavier in the recording, shallow gasps that mingled with the whisper of flurries striking metal and glass, and the forest itself seemed to press forward, the skeletal trees outlined in white, reaching, grasping, shaping the darkness beyond into something waiting just at the edge of comprehension. Every step he took toward the tree line was recorded in meticulous absence. No footprints, no broken snow, nothing that could anchor the sound in reality, and I felt the weight of it in my chest, a pressing certainty that the road and the woods and the storm had all conspired to leave only his voice, only the faint cry, and only the hint of movement, impossible to place. I leaned closer to the speakers, feeling the cold in my own office seep into my bones, listening to the officer inch forward, swaying toward the trees, toward something that should not exist in our world. The sedan waited behind him, still and abandoned, a silent sentinel to the unfolding unknown, and the snow continued, relentless, erasing, shaping, hiding, as if the storm itself was a conduit for something watching, guiding, waiting for the officer to step fully into the whiteout, where logic and law and reason had no weight, and only the sound of a small muffled cry promised that the night was far from over. He followed the sound deeper into the trees, flashlight slicing through untouched snow that refused to mark his passage, each beam revealing only the same frozen shapes and dark trunks, and every step felt heavier than the last, as if the storm had massed itself against him. The childlike crying began and stopped in strange rhythm, halting whenever he called out, resuming only when he stepped back. A cruel game played with sound alone. I could hear it through the recording, faint, muffled, almost swallowed by the storm, yet impossible to ignore, vibrating in the air around him and in the room where I listened, as if the blizzard had reached through the speakers. His breath grew ragged, clouds of vapor puffing unevenly in the cab as he tried to locate the source, and the wind, which had once roared across the pass, suddenly held still, leaving a silence so complete it pressed in on every corner of the recording, as though the forest itself had taken a breath and was holding it. Something moved just beyond the reach of his light, small, deliberate, and yet it left no trace, no footprints in the snow, no disturbance of branches, not a single imprint in the thick, powdery white. Each movement was suggested only by the fleeting shift of shadows, subtle enough that he questioned his own perception, calling out again and again, each repetition pulling the crying away, only to return once he hesitated. Dispatch notes throughout the file captured his rising tension, the way his breathing accelerated, the pulse of his voice carrying over static, punctuated by the snap of frozen branches under weight that never registered on thermal or night vision. The snow around him stayed untouched, pristine, as though time itself had frozen outside his circle of awareness, the air thick, cold, and impossibly still, while the crying wove in and out of existence like a ghost tethered to the storm. He swung the flashlight, moving left and right, attempting to illuminate something, anything, but the light found only the same white void, punctuated by black trunks and drifting snowflakes. And I could sense, listening through the recording, how the absence of evidence grew heavier than presence, how the impossibility of the footprints unnerved him more than the sound itself. There was a moment when he paused, hand on the cruiser door, chest heaving, and the crying halted entirely, leaving only the whisper of wind over metal and snow. But as he exhaled, the sound returned, this time closer, as if the trees themselves had whispered, guiding the sound around him in a perfect, intangible circle. Every instinct told him to retreat, to leave the snowbound tree line and return to the cruiser. But something, a mixture of duty, disbelief, and fear, kept him advancing, and with each step I could feel, through the grainy microphone and scratchy static, the line between natural and unnatural blurring. The snow refused to betray him, refused to mark the presence that followed. as if the world conspired to erase proof while leaving terror intact. He swept his flashlight again, catching glimpses of movement just outside its cone. Shapes that might have been small figures, branches shifting, or simply tricks of the storm. But the recording never clarified, never resolved, leaving only the sound of crying, the silence of untouched snow, and the gnawing certainty that something unseen circled closer. And I, listening from the office, could feel it pressing through the wires, through time, through the blizzard itself, the impossible, the inexplicable, the kind of presence that leaves only sound and shadow behind, leaving footsteps that do not exist in the snow and fear that refuses to let go. The officer retreated to his cruiser, the storm swallowing each step as though the world outside had been erased, leaving him alone on the mountain pass with nothing but the wind and the faint echo of crying from the trees. He moved quickly now, boots crunching over untouched snow, trying to convince himself the danger was behind him. But the recording carried every nuance, the subtle hitch in his breath, the scrape of his gloves against the door, the way the heater's hum did nothing to warm the air thick with frost and tension. Then came the first sound that truly shouldn't exist. Slow, deliberate crunching, circling the vehicle, moving in a rhythm entirely separate from the blizzard. The snow refused to record it, leaving no mark of passing feet, no indentation in the powder. Just the impossibly precise sound of something pacing, close enough that it should have been tangible but remaining entirely untouchable. He activated the thermal camera, fingers trembling slightly, and the display showed nothing. No heat signature, no shape, but as he watched, a cold silhouette drifted past the front bumper, its edges blurred, almost swallowed by the storm, and yet its presence pressed against the glass, against the metal, against the very air around him. He called out, hesitant, and the crying returned immediately, right behind him now, too close, too synchronized with his movements, and I could hear it through the recording as a sound that climbed inside the listener, coaxing panic with its proximity. Each repetition, each pause in the cry seemed calculated, the way the snow moved around him, holding its breath while the invisible steps circled closer, drawing him into the center of the unknowable. The officer's hands shook as he gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, and the microphone picked up every hiss of his voice over the static, each exhale visible as frost against the interior of the cab. But outside, the world remained unmoving, except for the impossible rhythm of approaching steps. He tried to peer over the hood, to glimpse something tangible, and in that instant the snow fell differently, drifting sideways in a slow, unnatural pause, outlining the edges of the figure that had been circling, teasing him from all sides, refusing recognition, refusing form. The crying became erratic, bursts of sobs and whimpers that seemed to travel faster than the wind, sometimes ahead of him, sometimes behind, but always keeping pace with his heart. I could hear the tension build in his breathing, uneven, rattling in the cold cab, and through the crackle of static, the faintest whisper of wind seemed to carry intention, guiding, shaping, pressing closer, as though the storm itself conspired with the presence. He fumbled with the radio, trying to call dispatch, but the channel hissed and warped, blending the wind, the crying, the impossible steps into a sound that made the cruiser vibrate subtly beneath him. Every instinct told him to leave, to flee the circling, stalking noise, but the presence, whatever it was, drew him forward, toward the center of the road where snow refused to show any proof of its passage, and yet its menace was undeniable. Each turn of the thermal display, each pause in the patrolman's movement, matched by the crying that always returned in a heartbeat, created a rhythm of fear that no logic could pierce, a cycle of sound and absence that forced him into a state of helpless anticipation. By the end of the recording, it was clear that the cruiser was no longer just a refuge but a stage and he was both actor and audience to an entity that used the storm, the snow, and the silence as instruments, orchestrating a circle that would tighten, escalating toward something that had no reason, no form, no mercy, only an inevitable confrontation that had already begun and could not be escaped. Static had begun to dominate the channel long before he noticed it. Low hiss and intermittent crackle threading through every word he spoke, and yet what followed wasn't the usual interference. The patrolman's voice, clipped and tense, was suddenly echoed back to him, delayed by barely a second, repeating his own sentences, his own questions, as though the storm itself, or something inside it, had learned to mimic him. At first, it was subtle, a curiosity, a quirk in the transmission, but as the seconds stretched, it grew clearer, more precise, almost intelligent. The second voice layering under his own, dragging his words out in a low, rasping imitation that made the hair on my arms stand straight as I listened through the recording. He demanded to know if anyone else was transmitting on the channel, and for a heartbeat there was nothing but wind, the whiteout roaring around him through the microphone. But then the echo returned, repeating his question, slower, heavier, almost deliberate, each syllable elongated and drawn down as though savoring the sound. The snow outside refused to betray the presence, still untouched, the headlights of the cruiser dim in the storm, and yet the voice carried through the static as clearly as if it were standing next to him, whispering from under the seat, from behind the door, from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Every attempt he made to respond, to speak over it, was absorbed, twisted, returned a moment later in the same dragging cadence, and I could hear the panic building in the recording, rising beneath the static, beneath the storm, in the officer's breath fogging inside the cab. The crying from the woods had shifted too, returning intermittently, weaving into the mimicry of his own voice, creating a layering of sound that made it impossible to distinguish source, to locate origin, or to assert reality. I leaned in closer, aware of the shiver racing down my spine as if the recording had pulled the cold from the mountain into the room, because each repetition carried intent, an intelligence that defied understanding, and it pressed against the edge of perception with a weight that made every hair stand on end. He tried again to call dispatch, voice sharp, commanding. A futile attempt to reclaim control, and the echo responded, repeating his command in that same low, unnatural drawl, now almost mocking, now almost sentient. There was a pause in the storm, or at least a pause in the sound captured in the recording, long enough for the silence to be deafening, broken only by the whisper of snow falling against metal. And then the echo came again, this time overlapping the crying, blending, merging, a distorted harmony of dread that invaded the interior of the cruiser. He moved, shifting in the seat, reaching for the microphone, his fingers trembling against the frost-laden metal, and the mimicry followed each movement, each hiss of breath, a constant companion in the growing claustrophobia of the storm. The snow outside remained pristine, untouched, betraying nothing of the presence, leaving him isolated in sound, trapped in auditory evidence of something he could neither see nor reason with. By the end of the transmission, the voice had become a separate entity, tethered to him yet independent, feeding off the storm, feeding off the fear, a parasite in the static that could follow every word, every hesitation, every attempt to assert dominion over the moment. Listening to it now, years later, I can still feel the slow, crawling weight of that voice through the speakers, a persistent reminder that whatever haunted, Ridge Pass was not bound by form or snow, and that the officer had been forced into an impossible conversation with something that knew him better than he knew himself, something that had already begun the next step of its inevitability, slowly encircling him in a storm that obeyed no rules but its own. The crying had changed by the time he realized it was no longer childlike. It had deepened, swelling into adult sobs that shook the cruiser from within, rattling the metal frame as if something pressed against the thin barrier of the vehicle, testing its resistance. Snow along the windows bulged in strange, uneven waves, rising and falling as though something beneath it moved with purpose, tunneling closer. And he could hear every crackle, every shift, through the microphone, each one magnified against the oppressive silence of the storm. The officer shouted, voice hoarse and trembling, insisting that something was crawling under the snow toward him, something alive, something that did not belong in the world of frost and ice. I could hear it through the recording, the subtle vibration under his seat, the way the cruiser shifted imperceptibly with every movement of this unseen presence. The sound of snow compressing in impossible patterns beneath the tires and along the driver's side, the ice groaning under pressure as if acknowledging the weight of an intruder. His hands clutched the steering wheel, knuckles white, as he leaned forward, pressing the radio to life in desperate hope that someone, anyone, would hear. But only static answered, distorted and hungry, carrying with it the faint, wet sound of something brushing along metal and glass. Every exhale, every word he called into the storm, returned in fragments through the channel, twisted and slowed. A voice that was his own, yet not, echoing the terror he was trying to describe, reinforcing it, amplifying it, as if the snow itself had learned to speak his panic back at him. The cruiser shuddered under his weight and theirs, an unholy rhythm of tremors, subtle enough to be ignored at first, growing louder with each heartbeat, each sob that seeped from the microphone, each crunch of snow that should not exist. His attempts to move, to shift his position, only seemed to encourage the disturbance. The sound of ice cracking beneath the driver's side wheel well was louder now, sharper, and the snow against the windows rose in unnatural folds, threatening to engulf him if he stayed still. The sobs became a chorus, merging with a second, rasping voice that echoed his commands and questions, making it impossible to distinguish origin, source, or intent. The officer's breathing hitched with terror, rapid and shallow, while his mind worked frantically to reconcile the impossible. The snow was moving. Something was beneath it, and yet the storm left no other traces, no footprints, no displaced trees, no signs of entry, nothing to confirm reality beyond the auditory proof that screamed at him through the static. I could feel it through the recording, the slow, insidious pressure of awareness pressing on the edges of the mind, the certainty that something alive, something aware, was tunneling beneath him, inching closer with every heartbeat, feeding off his fear. He screamed again, voice breaking, leaning into the wheel, gripping it with all his strength as the car groaned. As the snow shifted, as the unseen presence tested him like a predator savoring its prey. And I could hear, even through years of recording, the absolute, suffocating inevitability of the moment, the way the storm had become a conduit, the snow a membrane, and the night itself a prison. The last seconds before the transmission cut were a blend of sobbing, scraping ice, and distorted echoes of his own voice, merging into a single, unidentifiable howl, leaving only the weight of something beneath the snow, waiting, moving, relentless, and beyond the reach of any light or warmth or rescue. The cruiser shuddered violently as the pounding began beneath his seat, a relentless, impossible rhythm that vibrated through the metal into his bones, and he scrambled for the ignition, hands slipping on frost-laden controls, the engine whining in protest without turning over. The sobbing from outside the cab merged with the distorted echo of his own voice, each sound layering on the other, creating a living, breathing entity that had no shape, no origin, and yet pressed closer with every heartbeat. Footsteps circled the tires, irregular but deliberate, crunching snow in patterns that the eyes could not see and the thermal camera refused to register, as if the snow itself had become a conduit for something beneath it, something alive, something entirely aware of him. He braced himself against the steering wheel, pressing down, trying to anchor his body to the cruiser, to reality, while whatever was under him flexed, shoving, scratching, shifting, making the metal groan as if the vehicle itself were part of the terror. The adult sobbing intensified, now joined with small, distorted voices, whispers, echoes of a child repeating words he did not speak, all threading together into a chorus of impossibility that crawled along the cab like living ice. Every attempt to move, to reach the radio, to call for help was mirrored instantly, returned through the static in a lower, dragging timbre, mocking him, amplifying the panic he could not suppress. He shouted, screamed, kicked at the seat, but the presence beneath was patient, relentless, shifting in time with the storm outside and the tremor of the metal beneath him. I could hear it in the recording, the way the static swelled, the sobbing rose, and the pounding merged with his voice until there was no distinction between man, storm, or something that should not exist. Only a single, suffocating, omnipresent force pressing down. The tires groaned as the snow along the driver's side bulged, the ice cracking in irregular, splintered patterns, and the final moments captured on the recording were a chaotic symphony, scraping, pounding, sobbing, distorted mimicry of his own voice, culminating in one piercing scream, "It's under me!" A cry cut abruptly, leaving nothing but silence and the storm's howl echoing in its wake. Listening now, I can still feel the weight of that moment. The absolute certainty that something unseeable, something that moved beneath snow and metal alike, had claimed its space and vanished with him, leaving only the evidence of sound, movement, and the impossibility of escape lingering in the frozen pass. At dawn, the rescue crews finally reached Ridge Pass, slogging through snowdrifts that swallowed their boots and slowed each step, and found the cruiser half buried, headlights still piercing the pale morning haze, engine dead but warm as if it had just been abandoned. The snow showed no tracks leading away, not a single footprint in either direction, leaving the vehicle isolated in a perfect rectangle of frozen emptiness, as though it had materialized there without passage. Inside, the heater had run long enough to fog the windows, but what drew every pair of eyes immediately were the deep, clawed scratches carved into the windshield from within, gouges that could only have been made by something frantic, desperate, and impossibly strong, the jagged lines zigzagging as though whatever had been inside had tried to escape from beneath the seat. There was no sign of the officer, no gloves, no radio, no boots, only the cab itself, a frozen tomb holding the echo of his final moments, the sound of the blizzard still trapped in the fabric of the seats, the icy condensation, the frozen shudder of metal. Dispatch replayed the final recording, listening as the static whispered back the last fragments of his voice, each syllable delayed, distorted, returning seconds after the file had ended, as if the storm or whatever had claimed him had left a message lingering, tethered to the world. The sobbing, the scraping, the pounding beneath the seat. All were there in the silence of the recording, embedded in the room like a presence that could not be erased. A memory that had become physical, pressing against the listener long after the officer had vanished. I could feel it even now, decades later, the weight of something that had breached the boundary between snow and steel, human and impossible, leaving behind only the evidence of terror too complete to explain and too precise to ignore. The cruiser sat there, half buried in snow, untouched by any natural forces beyond the storm. A vessel of absence, of sound, of something that had existed just beneath the surface and then disappeared, leaving a void in place of a man. Outside, the blizzard had relented, leaving quiet, a frozen calm, But the scratches, the fogged windows, the faint, lingering static of the final words carried the truth. Ridge Pass did not release its own, and the snow kept the secrets of what moved beneath it. The officers on the scene murmured in disbelief, scanning the surrounding trees, listening to the frozen wind, but there was nothing. And yet everything. An unseeable, incomprehensible force had been there, and it had left behind only its mark and the impossible echo of life that once had been. The file ended, the recording cut, but faint static repeated his final words seconds after the end. A whisper in the empty morning. A reminder that whatever had claimed the officer was not gone, and Ridge Pass remained alive with its memory, waiting, patient, and hungry. The Roadside Choir. The highway stretched on in black emptiness, a ribbon of asphalt through abandoned plains, and the wind cut low, scraping across rusted fence posts and broken weeds like dry teeth. He drove slowly, headlights reaching only a few yards beyond the front of the cruiser, the engine humming a low monotone that matched the pulse in his temples. The radio squawked softly between dispatch calls, static-laden and faint, a reminder that even in the middle of nowhere he wasn't entirely alone, but that didn't make the night any less cold, any less hollow. Then the alert came, blinking on the console. Voices singing near the old silos. He frowned, adjusting the beam of the headlights, scanning the distance where grain towers rose like rusted monuments to forgotten harvests, tall and silent against the black sky. The words seemed absurd at first. Voices? Singing? In the middle of nowhere? He rolled down the window, expecting wind, expecting nothing. But the moment the glass lowered, it came. Faint, rhythmic, drifting across the field like mist. The chant had no direction, no beginning, no end. It twisted and folded in the air, echoing off unseen walls, amplified and warped in a way that made it impossible to tell where it was coming from. His canine in the back seat stiffened, ears pinning flat against its skull, growling low, a guttural warning that crawled up the officer's spine. The animal refused to move, leaning into the corner of the crate as though pressing itself against some invisible barrier between it and the singing. He could feel the tension in the dog radiating like electricity, and he realized that this wasn't the ordinary anxiety of being out in the dark, alone. Something had made its presence known, and the dog knew it before he did. The wind carried a chill that seeped into his jacket, crawling along his neck and arms, and he shivered, scanning the horizon for a visual clue, a person, a flicker of light. But the plains were empty. Nothing moved. The silos rose silently, giant rusted towers whose shadows reached like long fingers into the surrounding fields. The chanting rose slightly, a swell that made the hairs along the back of his neck bristle, looping and echoing as though answering itself, responding to his presence. He tried to rationalize it. Kids playing a prank, an abandoned radio, some wind-carried recording, but the sound was too deliberate, too perfectly timed to belong to anything ordinary. His pulse quickened as the dog's growls escalated, a warning layered over the rhythmic chant that now seemed almost alive. Each step of the tires over gravel sounded sharp, abrupt against the low, persistent wind, and yet the voices held, circling in the air, amplified in corners that didn't exist. The darkness beyond the headlights felt dense, almost physical, and the scent of earth, metal, and cold air combined into a tang that pressed at the back of his throat. He reached to adjust the window, half expecting the sound to stop if he changed his position, but it didn't. The chanting drifted higher, weaving in strange harmonics that tugged at the edges of his consciousness, making the air feel heavy, full of presence. The dog snarled, hacking a low, warning growl that made the hair on his arms stand stiff, eyes fixed on nothing visible, on the impossible. He felt a shiver run through him, a premonition he couldn't name, and he gripped the steering wheel tighter, knuckles whitening. The chorus held its rhythm, looping and overlapping, a faint melody rising out of nowhere, pulling the wind, the empty road, and the long abandoned silos into a single, impossible moment. He slowed, instinct telling him to stop, to back away. But the dark had a weight now, the singing a tether that clung to him and the K9, something patient, something waiting. For a few heartbeats he listened, silent, every muscle coiled, breath caught in the space between reality and whatever had claimed this highway for its own. And in that moment, the ordinary patrol shift, the quiet miles, the familiar route, ceased to exist. The night belonged to the chant, the plains to something unseen, and he knew, before he could act, that nothing he had known about this empty stretch of highway prepared him for what was coming. He parked near the cluster of silos, the headlights painting rusted walls with streaks of orange and brown, long shadows stretching across the overgrown lot like skeletal fingers. The wind shifted, carrying a low, eerie whistle through the cracks between metal sheets, making the towers moan in hollow resonance. The chanting had grown louder, or maybe he had simply drawn closer, he couldn't tell, but it twisted in the night now, echoing and bending as though the air itself had decided to carry it in impossible directions, circling back on itself in layers he couldn't untangle. His K9 stiffened in the back seat, hackles raised, ears flattened, a low growl vibrating through its chest. The dog refused to move, pressing itself into the far corner of the crate, gaze fixed on the nearest silo as if whatever was inside could already see them. He crouched slightly, peering into the back of the crate, but the dog's body was rigid, frozen in an alert it didn't waste on ordinary sounds. He tried to coax it out with soft words and hand gestures, tapping the side of the cage, but the animal's tension only grew, an instinct honed sharper than any human understanding. It wasn't the chanting that worried the dog, it was whatever had made the chanting real. The officer swallowed, tension curling into his stomach like a stone, and felt the wind bite through his uniform, cold and unnatural, carrying scents of rust, damp earth, and something chemical, faint and sweet, almost imperceptible. Each time he glanced toward the silos, the shadows seemed to shift, subtle movements at the corner of his eyes, too quick and precise to be random. The chanting twisted again, forming impossible harmonics, overlapping itself in a way that made the space between sound and silence feel unstable, as if reality itself were being teased apart by the noise. He exhaled slowly, trying to force his senses back to logic, telling himself it was empty warehouses, wind echoes. But the dog's low growl cut through that rationality, a living warning that whatever caused this sound, whatever haunted these structures, was real and close. He stepped cautiously out of the cruiser, boots crunching over gravel and cracked concrete, scanning the lot with the flashlight. But the beam hit nothing tangible. No figure, no movement beyond the swaying weeds, no flicker of human or animal life. Yet the dog stayed fixed, unflinching. A silent alarm that refused to be ignored. Every instinct screamed that approaching the silos would be a mistake, but his training pressed him forward, cautious, deliberate, aware that hesitation could be more dangerous than engagement. He felt the air grow heavier, almost viscous, and each step toward the tallest silo tightened the knot in his chest. The chant's rhythm had begun to match his own heartbeat, quickening, overlapping, a living pulse in the empty night. He realized that the sound no longer belonged to the distance. It belonged to the lot, the air around him, and the silos themselves, bending, twisting, anticipating his movements. He crouched again, shining the light into the shadows, and caught the faint glimmer of something metallic near a doorway, though he could not tell if it was debris or deliberate placement. The dog's growl rose in pitch, insistent, urgent, a warning sharper than any noise he had ever heard. His fingers tightened on the flashlight, knuckles white, as a cold dread settled over him, pressing into his spine. He understood then that the K9 sensed not just the chant but the presence behind it, the entity that waited inside the silos, and that stepping into the darkness would mean crossing a threshold that might never let him, or his companion, return. He took one more cautious step and felt the night tighten, as if inhaling, and the chanting swelled. A hypnotic rhythm circling them both, impossible to locate, impossible to ignore, and in that moment he realized he wasn't confronting echoes of sound, but something patient, aware, and watching from deep within. The grain tower's dot. He stepped out of the cruiser, boots crunching over cracked concrete and tangled weeds, and the wind hit him like a living thing, sharp and biting, carrying with it the scent of rust, dust, and something acrid, chemical, faint, and unsettling. The chanting had faded into a low hum now, almost imperceptible at first, but somehow matching the rhythm of his own footsteps, as if the sound were aware of him, adjusting, waiting, drawing him deeper into the abandoned lot. The grain silos towered above, dark and rust-streaked, shadows pooling at their bases in shapes that didn't match anything tangible. And every time he moved, the shadows seemed to stretch just a little farther, curl around corners, filling the gaps between the empty walls with presence. He noticed faint lines of soot and burnt residue scattered across the cracked ground, forming arcs and curves that led toward the largest silo, circles laid out with precision, as if someone, or something, had performed a ritual here not long ago. His flashlight beam traced the patterns, illuminating the edges of scorched metal and blackened soil, and he felt a chill creep up his spine. The marks were fresh enough to burn slightly to the touch, and old enough to hint at repetition. A ceremony performed and repeated over time. The K9 barked from the back of the cruiser, distant but sharp, a single note cutting through the hum, and the officer realized the dog's alertness was not toward him, not toward ordinary threats, but toward the interior of the silo itself, where something unseen lingered just beyond the threshold. Each step toward the main structure felt heavier, as though the air conspired to slow him, pressing in with an invisible weight, tightening in his chest. The scent grew stronger, a chemical tang mixed with the colder earth, burning the back of his throat and sharpening his senses. He stepped onto the first rusted metal step, and the hum of the chanting shifted subtly, rising in pitch, forming strange harmonics that made the hairs on his neck stand upright. The K9 whined low, a warning barely audible over the wind, and he hesitated, one hand resting on the rough steel of the silo doorway, feeling vibrations run through the metal as if something moved inside. His flashlight caught the first glimpse of shapes along the curved wall, blackened lines and scorch marks, hints of objects, patterns that hinted at arrangement, order, ritual. The deeper he moved inside, the more the air seemed to pulse with the sound, a rhythm that had no source yet seemed alive, circling him, pressing against his ears. The lines of burned residue curved perfectly around the center of the chamber, forming circles that drew the eye inward, and in the middle, illuminated by his swinging light, lay something unmistakable, a patrol badge coated in dust, one he did not recognize. Its surface scratched and worn, belonging to an officer reported missing months earlier. He froze, knuckles tight around the flashlight, feeling a cold weight press against his chest, and he reached out instinctively, fingers brushing the metal badge. The moment his skin made contact, the hum cut off, leaving a silence so complete it seemed to vibrate against his eardrums. A silence that carried more threat than sound ever could. Behind him, the K9 barked again, urgent and piercing, and he realized that the empty lot outside had not been empty at all, that every shadow, every echo, and every circle marked in soot had been waiting for him to step into the center, to acknowledge their presence. The air hung thick, warm, and still, the smell of chemical residue sharp and invasive, and he sensed, rather than saw, figures moving along the walls, brushing along the metal silently, waiting, circling, patient. The realization settled over him like ice. This wasn't a place abandoned, it was a stage, meticulously arranged to draw him in, to hold him, and to show him something he might not survive witnessing fully. He stepped fully into the silo, and the air shifted immediately, warm and heavy against the chill outside, carrying a faint chemical sting that made the back of his throat tighten and his eyes water slightly. The darkness pressed in from all sides, and his flashlight caught dozens of flares arranged in perfect circles across the concrete floor, their casings blackened and still warm, as though someone had lit them only moments before. The smell of burnt paper and fuel was sharp, almost cloying, lingering on his hands and in his hair, and he realized the meticulous arrangement of each circle implied intention, ritual, a purpose beyond explanation. At the center of one of the largest circles sat a patrol badge, coated in dust, worn and unmistakably official, yet not his own. The metal seemed to glint faintly under the beam of the flashlight, as if aware of his gaze, demanding recognition. He bent instinctively, fingers brushing the edges of it, and the moment his skin touched the cold, smooth surface, the chanting abruptly cut off, replaced by a silence so heavy it pressed against his eardrums, almost vibrating through the bones in his skull. He froze, every muscle taut, breath caught in his chest, and the sudden stillness of the world made the hairs on his arms and neck stand rigid. For a heartbeat, nothing moved, but the warmth of the air seemed to pulse around him, thickening like liquid, and he could feel the subtle shift of weight behind the walls, the hint of motion without sound. The canine barked from outside, sharp and frantic, the cry bouncing off the metal. But the dog's anxiety now felt like a warning more than a response to ordinary danger. He straightened, flashlight sweeping the chamber, revealing faint soot marks leading to smaller circles, remnants of previous fires, their centers empty but radiating intent, purpose. A pattern repeated over months or years, though he had no way of measuring time here. The silence lingered, stretching impossibly until he caught the subtle whisper of footsteps, far off, slow, deliberate, circling him from behind the walls. Each scrape and tap echoed unnaturally, multiplying, a rhythm that mimicked the beat of his own heart, yet came from nowhere he could pinpoint. Goosebumps rose along his arms as he pocketed the badge, but the moment he did, the hairs on his neck stood taller. The shadows seemed to lengthen, curling across the floor as if reaching for him. The air thickened further, almost suffocating, carrying the tang of burned flare residue and something metallic, sharper, more personal, like the scent of copper and fear combined. He realized that the figures, or whatever had orchestrated these circles, had been waiting, observing, shaping the space so that anyone who stepped inside would feel their presence, would know without seeing that they were not alone. The light from his flashlight seemed inadequate, bending strangely across the walls, shadows flickering, edges shifting, and he felt the first undeniable touch of dread, cold and purposeful, brushing along the back of his mind. Every step he took toward the exit pulled at the weight of the circles beneath his feet, and every breath he drew tasted faintly of smoke, metal, and something unnameable, like memory twisted into scent. He could feel the space pressing in, the walls breathing, the flare's residue forming an invisible barrier, demanding he acknowledge what lay at the center. The silence remained unbroken, the chanting gone, but the threat, the presence, had not left. He understood then that these circles were more than ritual. They were a warning, a claim, a mark, that whatever haunted this place was patient, deliberate, and still very much here, lingering in the shadows, in the warmth of the air, in the faint chemical tang that clung to everything he touched. The silence inside the silo stretched taut, thick and unnatural, pressing against his ears so that every heartbeat, every shallow breath, sounded loud, almost obscene. The flares in perfect circles seemed to hum faintly in the still air, their heat radiating subtly, carrying the burnt chemical scent that clung to his fingers and clothes. He stepped carefully, boots crunching on the soot and residue, and, for a moment, the world felt suspended, as though the night beyond the metal walls had ceased to exist. Then he heard it, soft, deliberate footsteps pacing behind him, at first singular, then multiplying into dozens, echoing against the curved steel like a chorus circling him. Each tap and scrape seemed to anticipate his movements, matching his pace, a rhythm impossible to locate, as though the figures themselves were aware of every step he took. The flashlight beam swung nervously, illuminating pale outlines pressed against the metal walls, shadows of shapes that bent and swayed unnaturally, whispering prayers he couldn't comprehend, the words twisting and repeating in patterns his mind couldn't decode. He froze, breath caught in his chest, realizing that each figure remained pressed to the curve of the wall, facing outward, as though avoiding him yet observing every motion, each whisper adding to a mounting weight that pressed in from all sides. He tried to back toward the exit, slow, careful steps, but the sound of footsteps tightened around him, the spacing shrinking, overlapping, closing a ring of presence that had no physical form but occupied every corner of the silo. Then something shifted. A head turned slowly, deliberately, even though the body remained perfectly still against the wall. The movement was precise, impossible, sending a shiver down his spine as his mind struggled to reconcile what he saw with what was physically possible. The temperature shifted suddenly, warmer, the air thick with a metallic tang that stung his nostrils, a mixture of burnt flares and something coppery, organic, almost alive. He felt it in his bones, the subtle vibrations along the floor, the pulse of presence circling him, waiting. Every instinct screamed to run, to escape, but the weight of the space, the oppressive awareness of dozens of unseen eyes froze him, anchoring his body to the floor. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, forming a dense fabric of sound that pressed on the edges of perception, turning ordinary fear into a gnawing, undeniable dread. His flashlight caught glimpses of shapes shifting just beyond recognition, arms bending at impossible angles, torsos pressing against shadows, heads craning toward him without moving. Each movement was deliberate, teasing him, showing awareness, yet remaining unreachable, untouchable. He backed slowly, trying to navigate the curves of the silo toward the exit, but the footsteps, the whispers, the shapes, all moved with him, orchestrated as though by some unseen conductor, closing the circle, making the walls themselves alive. His chest burned with tension, lungs tightening, hands gripping the flashlight so tightly his knuckles whitened. Then, just as he reached a point where the doorway should have been clear, he realized with cold certainty that the circle had grown, the figures multiplying, layering upon one another, until the exit was no longer a path but a funnel of intent, waiting to claim him, to pull him into the rhythm of the chanting that had once carried across the plains. The weight of it pressed down, heavier than air, heavier than stone, and for a heartbeat he understood fully that these weren't echoes, these weren't shadows. They were deliberate, aware, and patient, and he had stepped entirely into their space. He lunged toward the doorway, shoulders slamming against the cold, rusted metal, expecting the latch to give way, to grant him escape into the night, but the moment he pressed, the door moved first. Thick, heavy, slamming shut with a force that sent a shock through his chest and rattled the walls of the silo. The impact echoed, bouncing off curved steel, reverberating in a rhythm that seemed to synchronize with the shadows around him, multiplying the weight of presence, closing the space tighter, folding it in on itself. The footsteps that had circled him before now grew faster, pressing inward, forming an invisible ring that tightened with each step he tried to take. Whispers climbing in volume, layering, overlapping. Repeating prayers and names in fractured, frantic tones that made his head ache. The air thickened, warm and suffocating, charged with the metallic tang of burned flares and something sharper, more personal, like copper mixed with fear, pressing against the back of his throat and eyes. The K9 erupted outside the silo, barking frantically, nails scraping against metal. A desperate cry that cut through the oppressive hum of whispers and footsteps, but he felt powerless to respond, trapped in the center of the circle, a single human body against something that defied shape. Each step he tried to take toward the door was met with resistance, as though the space itself opposed him, bending his perception, warping his awareness. Shadows pooled and shifted along the walls, pale outlines of figures pressing closer, whispering unintelligible prayers, their bodies moving in impossible synchrony, heads turning toward him while torsos remained fixed, stretching the laws of reason thin. His flashlight beam flickered in his hand, shadows twisting unnaturally as if the light itself were being consumed, distorted, pulled into the shapes that watched and waited. He pressed his back against the wall, searching desperately for a weakness, a hinge, a gap, but the silo had become a cage, alive with intent, each circle of burnt residue now a boundary of awareness that he could feel pressing against his mind. Panic rose in his chest, sharp and biting, mingling with the cold sweat running down his neck, and he realized that whatever orchestrated this, whatever had performed these rituals, these circles, was not passive, not distant. It was patient, deliberate, aware of his every breath, every heartbeat, every movement. The whispers became urgent, overlapping in a rush of sound that turned into a pulse in the air, vibrating through his bones, through the floor, into his very chest, sinking with his fear. Then the door shuddered under his hands, but did not give, holding fast as if claiming him, as if the act of touching it was an acknowledgement that he was theirs now, part of the rhythm, part of the circle. The K9's frantic barking outside became a tether, a reminder of the world beyond. But the whispers, the shadows, the presence, the suffocating awareness of dozens of figures circling, waiting, watching, kept him rooted, unable to reach the safety he craved. Every instinct screamed to flee, yet every nerve told him the space had changed, that the silo itself had grown alive, grown aware, and that the exit he sought was no longer a path but a threshold he could not cross until it allowed him. The cold metal beneath his hands pressed in with impossible weight, the shadows pressed in from all sides, and the whispers, frantic, layered, human and not human, filled the air so densely he could almost taste them. He understood fully then that the silo was no longer a building, no longer an empty lot, but a vessel, a cage, a stage, and he had become the audience, the participant, trapped in a semicircle of intent that would not release him until it had decided he had seen enough, known enough, feared enough, and the weight of that knowledge settled over him as the first touch of inevitability brushed against his spine. He threw his shoulder against the door again, a desperate, shoving weight that rattled the rusted hinges and made the steel groan under strain, and finally it gave, swinging open with a shriek that tore through the night and sent a shock of relief through his chest. Cold air hit him immediately, sharp and biting, filling his lungs and cutting through the stifling heat of the silo. But the relief was fleeting. The chanting resumed instantly, louder now, layered and suffocating, following him as he stumbled into the open, echoing across the empty lot in a way that warped the darkness, making the shadows dance and stretch unnaturally. He felt the air pulse with sound, the rhythm pressing against his chest, synchronizing with his pounding heart, each note a tether pulling him back toward the interior he had just escaped. The K9 leapt into the front seat of the cruiser, refusing to leave his side, barking and whining, nails scratching against the metal floor, eyes wide, fixed on the darkened towers of the silos that rose like sentinels in the night. He slammed the cruiser into gear, tires crunching over gravel and debris. But the chanting kept pace, a phantom presence racing behind him, following each turn, each acceleration, blending with the wind and the hum of the engine, forming a chorus that seemed to occupy every corner of the empty planes. In his mirrors, shadows spilled from the silo openings, pooling and stretching as though the dark itself had taken form, moving with purpose, assembling in shapes that defied comprehension, their edges impossible to define. Every instinct screamed that looking back would make it real, yet he couldn't stop himself. Eyes flicking over the rear view, catching glimpses of forms that lingered too long, stretched too far, shapes that seemed patient, waiting for him to recognize their presence fully. The badge he had taken felt heavier in his pocket, a cold weight that pressed against his fingers, a tangible reminder of the missing officer, a token of some ritual claim that he didn't want to understand. The wind screamed past the windows, carrying a faint, echoing trace of the whispers he had left behind, weaving with the night in tones that made his stomach twist, gut tightening with a dread he couldn't shake. He pressed the accelerator, tires spinning over gravel, engine roaring against the night. But the air behind him seemed to thicken, the chanting circling, bending space in a way that made it impossible to measure distance. Each turn of the road, each mile stretched longer than it should, the darkness pressing in like liquid, shadows pooling, shapes forming at impossible angles, always just beyond the reach of light. The K9 remained tense, hackles raised, growls low and continuous, and he realized that the creature understood what he could not yet fully see, that the silos, the circles, the chanting, the shadows, were not bound by distance, that their claim had stretched past the walls, past the lot, to follow him out into the open plains, relentless, patient, aware. He gripped the wheel tighter, knuckles white, chest heaving, the night itself feeling alive. The empty land now populated with unseen observers, shapes and echoes that were impossible to outrun. The lights of the cruiser cut through the darkness, brief beacons of certainty in a world that had warped, twisted, taken on intent. And still, in the rear view he caught movement, shadows pooling into forms, gathering, watching, following. Not all of them solid, not all of them understandable, but every one of them deliberate, waiting, patient, and aware, as though the night itself had risen to claim the story it had begun without a witness. He returned to the station in a daze, the cruiser idling as if it, too, hesitated to leave the open plains behind, the night outside still thick with the echoes of chanting and shadow. Every street light, every crack in the asphalt seemed too bright, too mundane, a jarring contrast to the darkness that had pressed against him for hours, and yet the memory lingered like a weight in his chest, tangible, almost metallic in its grip. He parked and sat for a moment, hands tight on the steering wheel, knuckles white, listening for any sign that the world outside had returned to normal. But the silence was different, heavy, expectant, as though it had been holding its breath while he tried to put the night behind him. He set the badge carefully on his desk, watching the faint smudges of soot it left, lingering like a fingerprint of the ritual he had witnessed. a reminder that the place, and whatever haunted it, had touched him, left part of itself behind. Dashcam footage from the cruiser sat on the monitor, files that had initially corrupted in the heat of the chase, now syncing properly just once, and he pressed play, staring as the familiar footage rolled. The landscape outside empty, the silos rising like silent watchers, unyielding. And then, as the cruiser approached the lot, shadows emerged at the edges of the frame. Subtle at first, a hint of black pooling against the metal towers. They multiplied, forming shapes, circling slowly, deliberately, folding themselves into a semicircle that mirrored the arrangement of the burned flares inside the silo. The realization hit him slowly, stomach tightening. The figures weren't just inside the silo, they had been outside, awaiting him, forming a deliberate pattern as the vehicle passed. He leaned closer, eyes narrowing as the shapes solidified in the playback, the edges shifting unnaturally, impossible to define, like smoke given form, a choir of intent circling the silent towers. His breath caught, a cold, metallic tang rising in his mouth as the hum of movement pressed from the screen, and when he muted the playback, the chanting continued in his ears for several seconds, faint, layered, echoing in the room as though the space itself had become a conduit for memory and fear. He reached for the badge, fingertips brushing the smudged surface, feeling the heat of it, the weight, and understood that the silo, the circles, the shadows, had left something behind, a lingering presence that he carried with him now. The memory of the footsteps, the whispers, the impossible figures circling him in the steel walls pressed against the edges of his mind, unrelenting, and he realized that what he had seen was not contained by time or space, that the night had extended itself, folding into the real world, leaving traces he could neither ignore nor explain. He could feel it in the air of the station, subtle at first, a pressure behind his eyes, a shift in the temperature, as though the shadows had followed him home, patient, aware, waiting for the next movement, the next breath, the next moment when attention faltered. He wanted to call it a memory, a story, something he could file away, but the weight of presence, the tangible sense of deliberate observation, would not allow it. Every instinct screamed that he had been marked, that the night, the silos, and the choir of shadows had extended beyond the bounds of sight, leaving a semicircle of awareness that would never release him. The hum of dread remained, subtle, constant, lingering behind the muted playback, echoing in the silence of the station, and he understood with a cold clarity that the ritual, the chanting, the shadows, had not ended. They had merely changed form, existing now in the gaps between memory and reality, patient, deliberate, and watching, waiting for the next time someone stepped too close to the empty towers and the circles beneath them.